The unforgiving desert of New Mexico Territory stretched endlessly under the blood-orange sky of October 1889. It was here, in the shadow of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, that weathered cattle rancher Elias Blackwood made a discovery that would shatter his understanding of the natural world and condemn him to a fate worse than death itself. Blackwood had worked these harsh lands for over 20 years, building his modest ranch from nothing but grit and determination after the Apache Wars had finally ended. His closest neighbor lived 30 miles south, and the isolation suited him fine until the day he found the girl. She appeared to be no more than 16, with long black hair and traditional Apache dress, sitting motionless beside the dried creek bed that marked the northern boundary of his property. What struck him as unnatural wasn't her presence. Apache still traveled these ancient paths, but her absolute stillness. No breath stirred her chest. No movement disturbed the desert flies that should have swarmed around any living thing in this heat. Yet, when Elias approached on horseback, her obsidian eyes tracked his movement with an intelligence that was anything but dead. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the chill of winter wind through canyon walls. "You built your home on cursed ground, old man. Now you belong to it forever." Elias Blackwood had carved his existence from the unforgiving landscape of New Mexico Territory with the same methodical precision he'd once applied to tracking Apache war parties during his younger days as a cavalry scout. At 62, his weathered hands still gripped a rifle steady, and his pale blue eyes could spot movement across the desert flats from a mile away. The years had etched deep lines around those eyes, not just from squinting against the relentless sun, but from witnessing things during the Apache conflicts that most men preferred to forget. His ranch, modest by territorial standards, consisted of a sturdy adobe house, a small barn, and corrals that housed maybe 40 head of cattle on good years. He'd built it all himself after mustering out in 1869. Choosing this isolated stretch of high desert because it reminded him of home, if Kansas could be called home to a man who'd been wandering since he was 15. The nearest settlement, Las Cruces, lay 40 miles southeast, connected by nothing more than a dusty trail that disappeared completely during the monsoon season. Elias lived alone by choice, though he'd entertained visitors over the years. Traveling merchants appreciated his hospitality, and cavalry patrols still used his ranch as a waypoint when tracking rustlers or the occasional band of Apache who'd left the reservation. He was respected throughout the territory as a man who kept his word, asked no questions, and could be counted on in a tight spot. The loneliness suited him mostly. His only companions were a grizzled Mustang named Jeremiah and a one-eyed cattle dog called Moses, who'd shown up half dead 3 winters back and never left. Evenings found him on his porch, sipping coffee strong enough to wake the dead, while watching the sun set behind the jagged peaks of the Sangre de Cristo range. The mountain's name, Blood of Christ, had always struck him as fitting for a land that had seen so much violence. The Apache had been his adversaries during the wars, but Elias harbored no hatred for them. He'd learned their language out of necessity, studied their customs to better track them, and came to understand that they were simply defending their homeland against invaders, much as he might have done in their position. When the conflicts ended and most Apache were confined to reservations, Elias felt a mixture of relief and something approaching guilt. He'd helped break a proud people's connection to their ancestral lands. His property sat on what the Apache called Ghost Trail, a path their ancestors had used to travel between seasonal hunting grounds. Local Apache had warned him about building there, speaking in hushed tones about the hungry place where spirits of dishonored dead wandered without peace. Elias had listened politely but dismissed their concerns as superstition. The land was legal, surveyed, and deeded to him fair and square by the territorial government. The first signs that something was amiss came gradually, so subtly that Elias initially attributed them to the isolation playing tricks on his aging mind. Tools would disappear from where he'd left them, only to reappear days later in impossible locations. his hammer hanging from a tree branch 20 feet high, or his branding iron buried handle deep in ground so hard it should have taken a pickaxe to penetrate. Moses began acting strangely, whining at empty air and refusing to enter certain areas of the ranch after sunset. The dog's behavior was so unlike his normally fearless nature that Elias consulted the traveling veterinarian, who passed through twice yearly. The man could find nothing wrong with Moses, but mentioned that animals sometimes sense things humans couldn't. It was on the morning of October 13th, 1889, while checking his northern boundary fence line, that Elias first saw the girl. She sat beside the dry creek bed, as motionless as carved stone, and something deep in his cavalry-trained instincts screamed danger before his conscious mind could understand why. The Apache girl remained motionless for 3 full days, seated beside the dried creek bed like a sentinel carved from desert stone. Elias observed her from his porch through an old cavalry spyglass, noting that she never shifted position, never sought shade, and showed no signs of thirst or hunger, despite the merciless October heat that would have killed any living person. On the 4th morning she was gone. Only a perfectly circular patch of blackened earth marked where she had sat, ground so charred it looked as though lightning had struck repeatedly in the exact same spot. When Elias approached on horseback to investigate, Moses whimpered and refused to advance beyond 50 yards of the site. The air above the burn circle shimmered with heat distortion, though the surrounding ground remained cool to the touch. That evening, as Elias tended to his cattle in the main corral, he heard singing, a low, haunting melody in what sounded like Apache, though unlike any ceremonial chant he'd encountered during his cavalry days. The voice was clearly female, young, and seemed to emanate from multiple directions at once, creating an otherworldly echo that made his horses stamp nervously and his cattle bunch together in the center of the pen. The singing continued every night thereafter, always beginning precisely at sunset and lasting until the first star appeared in the darkening sky. Moses would howl in response, a mournful sound that seemed to harmonize with the mysterious voice. Elias found himself unable to sleep during these performances, drawn despite himself to stand on his porch and listen to words he couldn't understand but somehow felt in his bones. Objects around the ranch began moving with increasing frequency and boldness. His morning coffee cup would be empty when he returned from checking the water troughs, though he clearly remembered filling it. Tools relocated themselves not just to impossible places, but arranged in deliberate patterns. His hammers lined up pointing north toward the burned circle, his rope coiled in perfect spirals that resembled Apache pictographs he'd seen painted on canyon walls. The horses became increasingly agitated, refusing to graze near the northern boundary of his property. Even Jeremiah, his steady Mustang, who'd never shied from gunfire or rattlesnakes, would rear and bolt if Elias attempted to ride him toward the creek bed. The cattle followed suit, clustering as far south as the fence line allowed, their constant lowing taking on a quality of distress that set Elias's teeth on edge. Most disturbing were the footprints that appeared each morning in the dust around his house, small, bare feet belonging to someone who moved in perfect silence, despite the evidence of her passage. The tracks formed intricate patterns around his adobe walls, sometimes circling the entire structure multiple times, other times leading directly to his bedroom window where they simply vanished. On the 10th night after the girl's disappearance, Elias woke to find his front door standing wide open, though he distinctly remembered barring it before bed. A trail of those same small footprints led from the threshold to his kitchen table, where a piece of traditional Apache pottery sat filled with water that stayed ice-cold despite the desert heat. When he touched the vessel, images flooded his mind, visions of Apache families camping beside the creek when it still ran with clear water, ceremonies conducted under starlight, and burial grounds that stretched for miles beneath what was now his grazing land. He saw his own house rising from ground that had once held sacred lodge poles. His corrals built atop places where Apache children had played and learned the ways of their people. The final vision was the most disturbing. The girl herself, but alive, laughing as she danced with other young Apache women around a fire that burned where his burned circle now scarred the earth. As the dance reached its crescendo, the girl turned to look directly at him through the vision, her dark eyes filled with an intelligence that was both ancient and eternally young. When she spoke, her voice seemed to come from the pottery itself. "You have 3 choices, Cowboy. Leave this place and never return. Stay and become part of what you've disturbed. Or fight us and learn why the Apache fear to speak our names after dark." The pottery shattered in his hands, leaving only shards of clay and the lingering scent of desert flowers that bloomed only in the presence of the dead. As the days following the pottery incident passed, Elias found himself trapped in a waking nightmare that blurred the line between reality and the spirit world. Sleep became impossible as vivid dreams plagued his rest, visions of Apache ceremonies conducted on his very land, where dancers moved in intricate patterns around fires that burned without wood, their chants echoing through dimensions he'd never imagined existed. In these dreams, he witnessed the girl's true story. Her name was Ayana, meaning eternal blossom, and she had been the daughter of a powerful Apache medicine man who had died defending this very ground from cavalry raids in 1864. She had been buried here according to ancient rites, but when Elias built his ranch, he had unknowingly constructed his house directly over her grave, trapping her spirit between worlds and binding her to protect the desecrated land through any means necessary. The psychological toll became unbearable as Elias realized he could no longer distinguish between sleeping and waking. He would find himself standing in the burned circle at dawn, with no memory of leaving his house, his bare feet blackened by the perpetually hot earth. Moses would be beside him, whimpering softly, both man and dog seemingly drawn by forces beyond their control. The ranch itself began to change in ways that defied natural explanation. His adobe walls developed hairline cracks that formed Apache pictographs, symbols for death, binding, and eternal watch. Water from his well turned bitter, tasting of minerals that hadn't been there for 20 years. Most disturbing of all, his cattle began dying one by one, not from disease or injury, but simply lying down and refusing to rise, their eyes reflecting an otherworldly resignation as if they had been claimed by something unseen. During his waking hours, Elias experienced phenomena that challenged his understanding of reality. Objects didn't just move now, they transformed. His coffee cup became a traditional Apache gourd, his leather boots shifted into moccasins while he slept, and his Winchester rifle occasionally appeared as a traditional bow, strung with sinew that hummed with spiritual energy when touched. The girl's appearances became more frequent and substantial. Where once she had been a distant figure, she now materialized inside his house, always in his peripheral vision, never there when he turned to look directly. She would sit at his table while he ate, her presence so real he could smell the sage and sweetgrass that Apache women wore during sacred ceremonies. Yet her reflection never appeared in mirrors, and photographs he attempted to take showed only empty chairs and vacant spaces. Most terrifying were the conversations. Ayana spoke to him in perfect English now, her voice carrying the weight of decades spent watching her people's sacred places be violated by settlers who neither understood nor cared about the spiritual significance of the land they claimed. She told him stories of warriors who had been buried in the caves beneath his property, of children who had played where his corrals now stood, of medicine ceremonies that had kept the balance between the living and dead for generations. "You cannot leave," she said one moonless night as Elias sat paralyzed in his chair, unable to move despite every instinct screaming at him to flee. "The land has claimed you as it claimed me, but unlike me, you chose to stay when warned. Your stubbornness has bound you more tightly than any Apache curse ever could." The isolation that had once been Elias's comfort became his prison. His nearest neighbor seemed impossibly far away, and every attempt to saddle Jeremiah and ride for help ended with the horse refusing to leave the property, as if invisible barriers had been erected around the ranch's boundaries. Even Moses seemed resigned to their fate, no longer attempting to flee, but instead sitting vigil beside the burned circle, howling mournfully at spirits only he could see. As Ayana's influence grew stronger, Elias began to understand that this wasn't simply a haunting, it was a transformation. The girl wasn't trying to drive him away anymore. She was preparing him for something far more profound and terrifying than mere death. The climax arrived on the night of the new moon, exactly 1 month after Ayana first appeared beside the dried creek bed. Elias found himself drawn from his house by forces beyond his control, his bare feet carrying him across the cold desert sand toward the burned circle that had become the epicenter of his torment. The air itself seemed to pulse with supernatural energy, thick and oppressive, making each breath a struggle. As he approached the site, Elias witnessed the full manifestation of Ayana's power. The girl stood at the center of the blackened earth, but she was no longer alone. Spectral figures surrounded her, dozens of Apache warriors, women and children, all translucent but undeniably present. Their eyes burned with otherworldly fire, and their traditional garments flowed in winds that existed only in their realm. Ayana herself had transformed into something both beautiful and terrifying. Her youthful appearance remained, but now she radiated an aura of ancient authority that made the desert itself seem to bow in reverence. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of generations. "You have seen our sacred places desecrated, Cowboy. Tonight you choose your final path." The ground beneath Elias's feet began to crack and split, revealing glimpses of what lay beneath his ranch, a vast network of caves and burial chambers that stretched for miles in every direction. Skeletal remains glowed with phosphorescent light, and the sound of ancient chanting rose from the depths, performed by voices that had been silent for decades. From these subterranean chambers emerged more spirits, not just Apache, but the ghosts of all who had died violently on this land. Cavalry soldiers with gaping wounds, Mexican settlers with arrows through their hearts, and outlaws who had met their end in shootouts that predated Elias's arrival. All were bound to this place by violent death and unfinished business. Ayana raised her hand, and the spirits began to circle Elias in a ritualistic dance that grew faster and more intense with each revolution. As they moved, the very fabric of reality seemed to bend and warp around them. His adobe house flickered between its current form and the Apache lodges that had once stood in its place. His cattle corrals transformed into sacred ceremonial grounds where ghost dancers performed eternal rites. "You built your life on our bones," Ayana declared, her voice now echoing from multiple dimensions. "Every post you sank, every fence you raised, every breath you drew on our sacred ground bound you deeper to our world. There is no escape, old man. You belong to us now." Elias attempted to flee, but found his feet rooted to the earth as if the desert sand had turned to quicksand. The circling spirits closed in, their ghostly forms becoming more solid with each passing moment. He could feel their hands, cold as winter mountain streams, touching his skin, pulling him toward some terrible transformation. In that moment of ultimate terror, Elias understood that this wasn't simply about death or possession. Ayana was offering him a choice that would determine not just his fate, but his very essence. He could resist and be destroyed, consumed by forces beyond his comprehension. He could surrender completely and become another bound spirit, forever guarding the sacred land alongside the Apache dead. Or he could accept a third path, one that would transform him into something neither fully alive nor completely dead. A guardian who would protect the sacred places while remaining connected to both worlds. As the bone-chilling cold of the spirit realm enveloped him completely, Elias made his choice. His scream echoed across the desert, a sound that would be heard by travelers for generations to come. A warning and a calling that spoke of boundaries crossed and prices paid in full. The desert fell silent, save for the whisper of wind through sagebrush and the distant howling of a dog that would never again see its master in purely human form. Dawn broke cold and grey over the New Mexico desert, but Elias Blackwood was no longer there to see it, at least not in any form that could be called entirely human. The transformation had been complete, his essence forever bound to the sacred Apache burial ground that lay beneath his ranch, like a vast underground city of the honored dead. The first travelers to pass through the area 3 days later found the ranch eerily intact, but utterly abandoned. Elias's cattle had vanished without a trace, though their hoofprints led in perfect circles around the burned area beside the dried creek bed, before simply ending, as if the animals had been lifted bodily from the earth. His horse, Jeremiah, stood at the corral gate, wild-eyed and skittish, but alive and unharmed. Moses, the one-eyed cattle dog, was discovered sitting vigil beside the blackened circle, whimpering softly at something only he could perceive. Word of the mysterious abandonment spread quickly through the territory. The cavalry sent a patrol to investigate, but their horses refused to approach within a quarter-mile of the property, rearing and bolting at invisible threats. The commanding officer reported that the very air around the ranch felt heavy with unnatural presence, and officially recommended that the area be declared off-limits to military personnel. Local Apache, when questioned about the phenomenon, would only shake their heads gravely and speak in hushed tones of the cowboy who learned too late. They claimed that on certain nights, when the wind carried the scent of sage and desert flowers, travelers could hear two voices singing together beside the old creek bed, one clearly female and Apache, the other deeper, with the weathered quality of a man who had spent his life under the harsh southwestern sun. Prospective settlers who attempted to claim the abandoned ranch reported disturbing experiences that drove them away within days. Tools would arrange themselves in intricate patterns that resembled Apache pictographs. Water in the well remained ice-cold, even during the blazing heat of summer, and always carried the taste of mountain springs that didn't exist for hundreds of miles. Most unsettling of all, visitors claimed to see a tall figure in a cowboy hat standing guard at the northern boundary of the property, his form shifting between solid flesh and translucent spirit, depending on the angle of observation. The territorial government eventually stopped trying to resettle the land. Official records listed the property as unsuitable for habitation due to adverse atmospheric conditions, though local officials privately acknowledged that some places were simply too cursed for bureaucratic solutions. Years passed, and the ranch buildings slowly weathered back into the desert from which they had risen. Adobe walls cracked and crumbled, wooden beams warped and fell, but the burned circle beside the dried creek bed remained perfectly preserved, a black scar on the earth that neither time nor weather could erase. Moses lived out his remaining years in Las Cruces, cared for by a sympathetic shopkeeper who had known Elias. The dog never barked again after that October night, and would spend hours staring north toward the abandoned ranch, his one good eye tracking movements that no human could see. When he finally passed away in his sleep, townspeople swore they heard a distant howling carried on the desert wind, not one voice, but two, harmonizing in a mournful duet that spoke of reunion beyond the boundaries of life and death. Modern-day descendants of the Apache tribe still avoid the area, warning that some guardians never rest and some boundaries should never be crossed. They claim that the cowboy and the medicine man's daughter still watch over the sacred burial ground together, protecting it from those who would disturb the eternal sleep of the honored dead. On moonless nights, when the desert holds its breath and the veil between worlds grows thin, travelers along the old territorial roads report seeing lights dancing where the Blackwood Ranch once stood. Two figures moving in ancient patterns around a fire that burns without wood. their eternal vigil a testament to the terrible price of ignoring the warnings of those who understand the true power of sacred ground.